There's a public image in society that people associate with normal or sane thought. This is the common view of reality and life among the citizens. It is regimented and indoctrinated into the societal framework. This image agrees with an authority or government. It agrees with public education. And this image is also broadcast to everyone through the corporate television networks. The popular ideas and beliefs automatically pass from generation to generation, becoming even more reinforced over decades. If you disagree with this image of normalcy in society, you are pointed out by the other people who agree with their social image. Doctors might even declare you insane. Of course, they are also indoctrinated by the same system as the rest of society. Speaking of indoctrination, let's take a look at our education system and see where it came from. I think you'll find the next couple clips to be very interesting.
Schooling is a form of adoption. You give your kid away at his most, or his or her most plastic years, to a group of strangers. You accept a promise, sometimes stated and more often implied, that the state, to its agents, knows better how to raise your children and educate them than you, your neighbors, your grandparents, your local traditions do. And that your kid will be better off so adopted. By the time the child returns to the family, or has the option of doing that, very few want to. Their parents are some form of friendly stranger too, and why not? In the key hours of growing up, strangers have reared the kid. Now let's look at the strangers, of which you were one and I was one. Regardless of our good feeling toward children, regardless of our individual talents or intelligence, we have so little time each day with each of these kids, we can't possibly know enough vital information about that particular kid to tailor a set of exercises to that kid. Oh, some of us, will try more than others, but there simply isn't any time to do it to a significant degree. So what we do is accept, and of course if we don't accept this, we're fired or harassed. We accept a state's prescription that's written in manuals. You do this first, and this second, and this third, and here you have a little latitude to talk to the kids. And the way the state checks on whether you've followed that diet is there's standardized tests given at intervals. If your kids do badly, it does not mean that they're bad readers or anything else. It means that they haven't been obedient to the drills the state set down, and they're marked for further treatment later on, or they're marked to be excluded from responsible jobs. Perhaps some ways by being excluded from the colleges that lead to responsible jobs, in other ways from the licenses that lead to responsible jobs. This was all worked out. It didn't evolve by a lot of rational people saying, we'll take this, this, and this from the past, then the next generation will take this, this, and this. This was set down largely in a handful of places. Prussia was perhaps the most prominent of those places. And the Prussian experiment leaped into the United States almost immediately in the 1840s, leaped into the United States. Its propagandists covered the country here. Its backers, its financial backers, set up the most important teacher training institutes and financed those institutes. And then no one was allowed to become a teacher who didn't more or less subscribe to the fact that experts could create a curriculum and pedagogues could administer it. Well, that's exactly what Horace, the Roman essayist, talked about in several of his essays. He said, the master creates the lessons. The pedagogue, the teacher, administers the lessons. But if you find the teacher creating the lessons or deviating from the direction those lessons are headed in, you get rid of the pedagogue. But the people who gave us schooling weren't these wealthy people. They were utopian thinkers who believed the family and tradition were the greatest obstacles to making a perfect society, a utopia. And every utopia that survived invents schooling long before we had universal force schooling. There were always little neighborhood schools, and but they all invent universal schooling of a homogeneous variety in order to reach utopia. Now let's shift to the basis of your question, which is Rockefeller and Carnegie and J.P. Morgan. These people saw a different kind of utopia through solving the problem of production with high-speed machinery. They saw that material abundance could be created, and that want, first of all, of course, they thought they could become supremely wealthy, which they did. But secondarily, they weren't beasts. They thought that this material abundance, since they had abandoned a belief in a creator or an afterlife, this material abundance was the best that a human life could aim for. And to do that, the family had to be moved off center stage, and the children had to be processed like raw materials. These are the people who saw to it with their influence that when legislation that was wildly radical based on any past model was proposed, that the right legislators would vote that legislation through. They saw to it that money was available to build these vast piles of brick and stone and to drain children out of the community by the force of law, mind you. If you gave children and families options, it probably would take half a decade before many people tried the options. But I think inside of a decade, the institutional schools would vanish because they don't teach the way children learn, nor can they teach the way children learn. That's not what they're set up to do. They're set up to produce a predictable, homogeneous, safe product. They're set up to sort people into occupational categories, roughly consonant with what the current economy demands. Your theorists, through history, were the first to reflect on the best, most efficient ways to manage populations. And your theorists worked out state institutions very early on. I'll give you one example that caused the socialization of populations and the stratification of populations to take place, I won't say indelibly, but certainly to an extreme degree, very early on in the 17th and by the middle of the 18th century, the stratifications across Europe were perfect, and there was no way really to escape unless you were a highly unusual person and you could see through a lot of the constraints on us, a lot of the strings that hold us like puppets are really inventions of our own mind. I'm not saying that there aren't armies and police and various ways to punish deviance, but there isn't any way to punish a large number of deviants. There isn't any way to do that. It's too expensive to even try to do it unless you can colonize the minds of children growing up so they become their own police. And they will report other children who are deviating.
My name is Charlotte Thompson-Iserbade, and I served as Senior Policy Advisor in the United States Department of Education under the Reagan administration, during which I had access to all of the most important documents for the restructuring of not only American education but global education. And I'm also the author of The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, which gets into all of this, gives the background of what I saw not only in the Department of Education but as a local school board member. I was trained to identify the resistors to the sex ed, drug ed, alcohol ed, suicide ed, death ed, those good, smart Americans who realize that anything that has education hanging off the end of it is probably not what they're looking for. I was trained to identify those good people and to go up against them, and actually to go and try to get them to join us through the group process system, make them feel important, get them on a committee. And when that just blew my mind. I have to say, people often ask me, what is it that got you involved in education? Well, finding out what I saw at the local level certainly upset me. When I went and I saw that Americans were being trained to identify resistors, then I got pretty upset. And luckily, there was a big book that came with the in-service training called Innovations in Education, A Change Agent's Guide. And I was able to take that back home with me. Unbelievable examples of how to con the Christians and different people who are upset with what you're trying to do, how to bring them over to your side, case studies, true case studies of educators who had put programs in that normally, in a normal American town, nobody would want them. How did they manage to get them in? How did they con the people? And the other thing was, not only was I trained to identify the resistors, I was trained to go to the important people, high profile, highly thought of people in the community, with the Rotary and Chamber of Commerce, Garden Club, you name it, the different groups in our towns. Go to them and convince them of the importance of these new programs like sex ed, drug ed, I just mentioned all of them, and to get them on your side, because when you can get the leadership in a community to go along with it, then the newspaper comes in and says, a committee's been set up with the head of the Rotary and this and that, and they're all getting behind this task force to discuss whether we're going to have a new sex education program. And then when Mary Jones, who ordinarily would think, why would we want to have a sex education program when we don't have any problems with kids having sex or anything? So she might be concerned. She might be one of the resistors. She reads that her best friend, who's the head of the Garden Club, is on this committee, and she thinks, oh, well, hey, Mary Appleton is on that committee. She's heading it up. It must be okay. So I was taught really how to con the community.
Education has been controlled in a way that allows for a very strict, regimented result in each student. The student has been treated as a product of the state. The Clockmaker realized that compulsory education was an efficient means of building the students' minds and molding these blank slates into whatever social condition is practical for the time and place. Within just a few generations, people's minds could be changed from independent thought to complete dependence on the state to provide answers, all based on the Prussian education system. But there is another form of education that is still practiced today. The classical 7 liberal arts provide critical thinking skills in a way that allows for the individual to process what they receive from the senses, categorize that information, and make logical judgments from that. And the understanding comes from the self using the 7 liberal arts, rather than the Prussian idea of understanding coming from some greater authority. The 7 liberal arts empower the individual, while the Prussian system takes that independence away. The very same people who control finance, commerce, government, education, industry, and law have been trained at prestigious Ivy League schools with the 7 liberal arts. If you happen to be a child of these people, then you will also be trained for independent, logical thought. The idea is to perpetuate independence in these wealthy and influential families to ensure the security of their positions in the social hierarchy while keeping the majority of the people in a state of dependence and subservience. Let's take a look now at the 7 liberal arts and other forms of independent thinking to see how this can be achieved.
These things have been hidden from us here in America and probably Europe for the last 100 years. They've been taken away. The founding fathers, for example, of the United States had this. And of course, they were the elite members of the community at that time. And the elites today in our country, those that attend the 8 prep schools, are given the trivium. But we're not. And it's available to us. And it can be studied if it's studied in the proper sequence.
Give somebody the trivium, and then they naturally figure out all the BS that's out there about everything else because they understand the logical fallacies and they begin to see through all of the crud out there and can begin to really think for themselves. And if you're not familiar with the subject and predicate, if you're not familiar with the logical fallacies and how they break down, if you don't have a firm grasp of these things, folks, you don't have critical thinking.
So once you realize that critical thinking's been taken out of our everyday kind of common sense process, we're left to indulge ourselves in propaganda and all sorts of forms of media, and we're left kind of defenseless. We don't have a way to discern fact from fiction, a way to, distinguish between reality and illusion. So we're kind of left to let our emotions make decisions for us, which is less than rational. John of Salisbury talks about in a Metalogicon of 1159, what he's presenting is a defense of rational and critical thinking in a time when there was a lack of rational and critical thinking. It's a parallel to what's going on right now. So what happened 950 some years ago is going on right now, and it's history compressing itself. We have all the things that have ever happened in history happening simultaneously in their new forms, and we have to struggle to keep up with this wave and understand how it's manifesting and how it flourishes so that we can participate positively in these types of cause and effect consequences.
The 7 liberal arts have their roots in ancient Greek philosophy. At least that's what we're told by the historical sources. The arts might actually go back further than the Greek times. It's clear to see the aspects of the arts in Greek philosophy, even if they weren't organized in the traditional sense of what the 7 liberal arts actually represent. First off, we must define the word liberal. This word has been carried through time, and it's been redefined over and over. The source of the word translated into the principle of free, in the truest sense of the word. The word library stems from liberal, and a book was termed as liber, to represent the freedom of the mind or thought that can be obtained through reading books. Liberal, in its actual form, refers to the freeing of the mind and the power that can be individually achieved through the discovery of information, the processing of that information, and being able to use what you learn to control your own life, and even to control other people's lives in some cases, to free them or bind them. The 7 liberal arts are composed of a trivium of critical thinking, which has 3 basic parts or components, and an additional 4 subjects to operate the critical thinking on, called the quadrivium. A quick way to look at the 7 liberal arts is to take an allegory based on Pythagoras' work in geometry. We have 5 senses. There are 4 subjects in the quadrivium, and 3 components to critical thinking in the trivium. Now, if you have a string that is 12 segments long, you will find that it will form one very special type of triangle. It's a right triangle with 2 sides forming the 90-degree angle, composed of a 3-segment length and a 4-segment length. The resulting hypotenuse, or third edge of the triangle, is the 5 remaining out of the original 12 segments. Sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste bring and reflect to us the 4 subjects of the quadrivium. These subjects are mathematics, geometry, music, and astronomy. But these are allegorical terms meant to relate the importance of the 4 subjects to each other. What is very interesting about these subjects is that they show a relationship between space and time to each subject. That's the purpose of the quadrivium. Math is number that is outside of space and time. Geometry is number in space alone. Music is number in time alone. And of course, astronomy is number inside of time and space, or the connection between the 2 principles. These 4 subjects are basically allegorical representations of the way that time and space manifests itself to us in our observation of the universe. It's very interesting that these concepts were thought up so long ago. Now, the trivium is a system of looking at information that comes to the observer through these 4 subjects, through the 5 senses. And rationally understanding all of this information and taking all of the contradictions and error out of the equation, and then using the newly formed wisdom to be able to express that wisdom to others, or simply using the wisdom to build or construct something outside of oneself. It's like a computer where you have an input stage and you're typing into a keyboard. Well, that's the grammar. That's the first stage of the trivium. It's the input stage. Then you have the critical thinking or logical process, where you take all of the information that you receive through your input and decide whether or not information is valid rationally or not. You throw out everything that's no good, illogical, or not rational, then you put it back together again for your output stage, which means you're going to display it on the screen. It's a great way of looking at the way that the trivium is used in logic. So the first stage, like I said, is the grammar stage, and that's just the information. It doesn't mean we're talking about the way to use letters or the way to punctuate your sentences. Grammar is literally the information that you're receiving and the structure of that information. Then from there you go to this logical thinking or cognitive stage, where you're trying to weigh out whether or not something is logical or rational. And then you move on from that critical thinking stage to the third stage, which is the output stage. And that is rhetoric. That is your wisdom. That is you actually acting on the information that you've processed. Here's some resources you can look into to find even more clarity and understanding of what the upper crust of society have at their disposal while we remain ignorant of these profound tools of wisdom. The Metalogicon was written by John of Salisbury in the 12th century. It gets into the principles of how the trivium and logical thought can be used effectively for one's own rhetoric. The Lost Tools of Learning by Dorothy Sayers is an article written in the middle of the 20th century. She was a teacher who noticed the problems with the current system of education. She found herself teaching children. You can easily find this article in its entirety online with a quick search. Dr. Randall Hart wrote, "Increasing academic achievement with the trivium of classical education, its historical development, decline in the last century, and resurgence in recent decades." It's another wonderful resource. And of course, you can also look up videos and interviews with people like Charlotte Iserbyt and John Taylor Gatto, or maybe even read his books. You can also check out Jan Irvin's triviumeducation.com website, or his podcasts on gnosticmedia.com. There really is a wealth of information and help for those of you who wish to find some clarity and logical ground to stand on with these tools. Much of this wisdom is free to download, read, or watch. Why not take advantage of these tools and step out of the status quo of thinking that you've been forced into?
The government. It loves you and wants to keep you safe and well. It even wants to make paying taxes, fines, and court costs easier for you. How? Well, you'll need to meet your straw man. He was born the same day you were. He looks like you, has the same name, and lives in your house, but you never knew he existed. You will have even paid his parking tickets or taxes. The worst part? He's been dead from day one. From every birth certificate, a legal personality, or legal fiction, is created with the same name to confuse little old you into thinking it's you. So there's a human you and a paper you, or as it's commonly known, a straw man. So when it seems like government officials, court clerks, or the police are speaking English, they aren't. They're speaking legalese, designed to make you agree to verbal and written contracts without even knowing about it, all spun from Black's Law Dictionary. For example, when the police say, "Do you understand?" you'll say, "Yes." What they are really saying is, "Do you stand under our authority?" Oops-a-daisy, you just created a verbal contract with them. Oh, you clever government. Did you know that whenever you register something, you are handing over title to the person you register it with? That's right. Whenever you register something with the government, they assume it belongs to them. Registered your car? Super! Now you are the registered keeper of your vehicle, and the government can crush it when you don't pay your, straw man's taxes. Expecting a new bundle of joy? Well, then you need to register your little darling with a birth certificate. Then they can start the process all over again and create a new straw man for your little one. Isn't that great? So when Junior grows up, he'll be able to generate revenue just like you have. When you notify on your baby by signing the birth certificate, your child becomes a ward of state. And if the government doesn't like what you're doing, they'll assume it's okay to take the child away or make new rules for things they don't like. Not enough school? Smacking your child? Shouting too loudly? And it's off to social services for the little one. When you get a bill, it's sent to you but belongs to your straw man, not you. That's why bills, fines, and summons start with Mr., Mrs., or Ms. Sometimes you'll see your surname in capitals, just like on a gravestone. That's because your straw man is dead and just a silly piece of paper, created before you could comprehend or even consent to it. When you go to court, you represent your straw man, so you, the human, take on any costs, fees, taxes, and fines involved for the straw man. The human you doesn't even need to pay them. But you made a contract with the court by appearing on behalf of your legal personality or straw man, just like the government knew you would. Confused? Well, don't worry. The government doesn't want you to know anyway. If you knew, you'd stop paying things like council tax and parking tickets. Because when you go to court, you are representing your straw man. You are you, alive and made of flesh and blood. Your straw man, or legal personality, is a piece of paper created from your birth certificate. And you think it's you. What a silly Billy. Would you like to know more? Well, then go over to tpuc.org. Get up, get informed, and get real.